Today we have The Devil Does Not Exist, the role of deception in cyber, and it's Mark Mateski and Matt Devost. So,
hey gang, sorry I'm late. Had the review board luncheon and they tend to want to talk a lot, so yeah, I actually had to leave early from that. I'm here as a co-presenter, but the honesty is really I'm just kind of a coach. This is Mark's material. One thing that I've been a big fan of, having been in the cybersecurity industry for 20 years, but also having been involved in a lot of different aspects, working with the military, working with the intelligence, law enforcement communities, is finding lessons learned and nuggets that are taken from other disciplines that actually apply to the discipline that we're in. And I think this is a perfect example of that. The first red team that I put together, we actually went and debriefed with some of the Navy SEAL teams who were doing the physical red teaming and said, how can we apply some of their methodologies, some of their principles? And the reality is, when you think about deception, we're doing it every day, right? The adversary is doing it against us. Hopefully we're trying to do it against the adversary. There's a lot of things that need to bring this into perspective, that we're dealing with human beings at the end of the day. Jay Healy had a great quote a couple years ago, said your attacker is not a 1 or a 0. But we tend to think of it in terms of it's a technical problem. There's a human attacker on the other end of the spectrum. The attackers are also good, as we all know, at exploiting kind of the human factors component, right? We are pre-wired to believe the lie, right? There's just some human nature aspects where we're easy to convince. Well, hackers and attackers are wired the same way, so you can reverse that on them as well. And overcome, and I know Mark will talk to this, some of the cultural bias associated with deception. For some reason, sometimes we feel that lying, even if you're in an adversarial situation, is not a good thing to do when it actually could provide you real strategic benefit. Long-standing disciplines in gaming, human behavior that can apply to our domain. One of the things we did in talking and putting this talk together was sat down and talked to Jose Rodriguez, who is the director of clandestine services at the CIA, and talked to how do you trick people in real life? How do you measure and put these things in place? And there's applicability on both the attack and defense side. I'm going to let Mark get into the content, but there's a few things I wanted to frame going into it. When you think about deception, you say, well, how does it apply to me when he's stepping through the game theory associated with that? Just think about getting the attacker to go after the wrong target, right? A mechanism of deception in this space. Being able to do passive monitoring or implied monitoring to influence an attacker's behavior. Right? It doesn't always have to be the fact that you're going to eradicate somebody off the network. Intentionally attribute to wrong class of attacker. We've actually seen and done this as well. You publicly disclose or talk about dealing with one class of attacker to kind of throw them off guard. Impacting their OODA loop, providing false data. We've done this in several instances where you know that they were trying to access data to utilize in their decision loop, and we polluted the data and thus polluted their decision loop. And we did this on some transactions that were hundreds of millions of dollars, where the attacker was breaking in, stealing the financial details, using it to their advantage. We polluted the data from a deception point of view. Or to attract them to honeypots and some of the kind of traditional mechanisms that we're familiar with. On the attacker side, feigning a false level of sophistication. We've seen that, where they come in and feign like they don't have a capability to attack certain platforms when they actually do. Deception on their targeting, what they're going after, and then of course the egress deception, which we've seen a lot of more sophistication with, at least I have over the past couple of years. So that I'm going to turn it over to Mark to step you through kind of the real content, the meat, and the game theory associated with some of this.
Alrighty. I think I was first interested in deception back in the 70s. You probably remember the Rockford Files. Who remembers the Rockford Files? Yeah, a fair number. It's funny, I was reading one of Kevin Mitnick's books, I think it was a few years ago, and he mentioned at the beginning of his book how the Rockford Files inspired him to pursue the topic of deception. If you never saw the show, it was James Garner. Classic Garner move was he had a little printing press, a mini printing press. He could print out business cards. He just kept it in the back of his car, and he'd be an insurance investigator one day, and he'd just swipe that, and then he'd go in and socially engineer his way into something. That's when I became fascinated. The problem is I don't think I'd be very good at it. That's not my personality. My wife and I were joking before we walked over here that I would make perhaps a good detective, but she would make a good criminal. She can pull that kind of stuff off. I can't. I just study it and think about it and talk about it. But anyway, I'm going to jump to the end and give you a picture, hopefully, of what it is I'm talking about. My goal here, this is really quite a simple concept, I think, but I'd like you to walk out at the end of this time with a new tool in your toolkit, a new way to see the world. It's simple. I hope you don't sit here and go, that was too simple. But my sense is finding simple patterns is more useful in the long run than making this more complex than it really is. And if I can give you 3 patterns to look for, which is my goal, you can walk out of here going, all right, I've got a label I can attach to these patterns of deception. And now when I see deception, when I see risk and opportunity associated with deception, that will pop back in my head. So I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to tell you a story. You may have seen this movie again before. If you haven't seen the movie 36 Hours and you don't want to hear what happens, cover your ears. Spoiler alert, it was made in 1965. If you haven't seen it yet, anyway, it's not like it just came out. It's James Garner again, and it's based on a short story written by Roald Dahl in 1944 called Beware the Dog. And it's an interesting concept. They knock him out, it's a World War II story. They knock him out in neutral Portugal. They drag him off to Germany, and he wakes up in what appears to be an Allied hospital. He's recovering from an injury. Everybody's speaking English around him. All the doctors and nurses, he gets a newspaper that makes it look like the war is over. So they put him in this situation where everything is supposed to be as it appears to be, but it's not. They're running a con on him. So he picks up on little clues, little things that don't add up, and he starts to suspect that everything might not be as it appears to be, that they might be running a con on him. So at that point, the question is, what should he do? He sees through the con, he perceives it, he sees through the secret of the lie. What should he do? And that's where I think things get most interesting. I think there's a tendency in human nature, if you see through the con, if you find out the secret, you want to break that open. Stop it, break it open. That's where, again, things get interesting. I think if you go to the next level, and you'll see in the slides here, I call it a hypercon. When you're aware of the con, and the con isn't aware that you know about the con, that's where you can do some interesting things. So what could, for example, James Garner have done in that movie? He could have given him false plans, for example. He could have started weaving a story once he saw through it in a way that hurts them worse. And this is just anecdotal. I don't have any data to support this, but my hunch is that you've got 3 levels here. You've got eye to eye, where everything is as it appears to be. You've got a con, and then you've got above that what I call a hypercon. I think the pain between the eye to eye and the con is severe. You're going to be surprised. But the turnaround pain on the con to the hypercon, my hunch is even greater, because the con thinks they're going to pull a surprise on you. They've got their surprise blinders on. You pull a hypercon on them, and you can hit them pretty hard. And I have some examples here that I think back that up. So that's the end. I just gave away the conclusion. Think about that story, though. If you were James Garner in that situation, what could you do once you figured out the con, but you don't let them know that you figured out the con? Let me give it some context. Matt mentioned this briefly, but historically, Westerners have been averse to cons, to trickery. It's been viewed as a less than noble endeavor. World War II, the British and the Americans, particularly British, actually turned out to be very good at deception, but their backs were against the wall. Think of 1939, 1940, Britain is under a real threat, an existential threat. They're scared, they turn to deception. In the East, the practice of cunning is perceived very differently, at least traditionally. There's a very interesting book. It's a real thin book, and you'll pay an arm and a leg for it on Amazon. I've got the reference here at the end. But Wheeler points out in this book, it's on stratagem, that there's a tension in the West between the advocates of what he calls the Achilles ethos and the advocates of what he calls the Odysseus ethos. And the Achilles ethos is face to face. It's honorable, we're going to fight it out, no trickery. The Odysseus ethos is play a trick. Get out of it, maybe you don't even fight. You win the battle before it even starts. That contrasts with the way trickery is perceived in the East. So you probably, my guess is this crowd is probably, from many of you, familiar with the 36 stratagems. Chinese body of literature, the stratagems each have a name, a label. And what's interesting to me is, this is a quote from von Singer. He's a Swiss analyst, he's a sinologist. He studies stratagems, he's got some great books on it. But he points out that these stratagems, these 36 stratagems, with their labels, are highly condensed, and it's interesting to read through his material. I've never lived in the East, but apparently these 36 stratagems are labels that show up in the media, in children's books. So, kill with a borrowed sword, for example, is one of those. You've probably heard that before. Those labels become hooks in the Eastern mind that you can reach for. Every stratagem isn't new to them because they've got these labels. And he points out that they're generally used spontaneously, and they have these linguistic tags. And so in the West, where we reinvent the stratagem every time, that's very different from the East, where they have these linguistic tags and they can reuse and reuse the stratagem. As he points out, Europeans can't ask this question of what stratagem, because we don't have the language for that. Think back to the Rockford Files. There probably was a pattern of stratagems he was using again and again and again in those episodes, but we don't have a name for him. He points out Machiavelli, for example. You start thinking of stratagem in the West, Machiavelli is probably the first name that pops into your head. Well, Machiavelli will describe cunning things, but there's no linguistic tag associated with any of those. So we don't have a Western terminology for trickery. Except in one case. I want to point this out because I think this is interesting. Con artists actually have linguistic tags for what they do. And they have for a long, long time. They have names for their different tricks. If you just look up, do a search on cons, and you're going to find a list, say on Wikipedia, of 40, 50 cons that they use again and again. They have names for these, and they know what they're talking about. I think it was I'm trying to think back, Ocean's 11 or 12. You see them sitting around a model of the casino, and they're just rattling off these patterns like, this or this or this or this. They have these short linguistic tags, and they talk the same language. But it's something in deception studies that we generally don't look for in the West. They also have, just to build on what the language of con artistry, they have the concept of the short con and the long con. The short con that you turn around, it happens right then. The long con, you play it out. You probably remember the movie The Sting. There's a great book called The Big Con, written in 1940, interestingly enough by a linguist who was studying cons and their language. So in the West, we do have it a little bit, and it's in the world of con artistry. So this is my goal today, and I kind of hinted at this up front. I'd like to give you just a couple of linguistic tags to help you think about deception. The risk and opportunity associated with deception. Matt talked about the defender and the attacker. Well, it's a two-sided coin. Surprise deception poses a risk to you if you're surprised, but flip that coin over, and that's the opportunity side. So there's an opportunity. If you can turn that con into a hypercon, that presents you a great opportunity. So I'm calling this the lexicon, since it's kind of rooted in con artistry. But it's relatively simple. 3 games or 3 levels and 2 perceptual states. And I've tried to represent this diagrammatically. I don't think you have to. This is actually rooted in game theory, but it's a branch of game theory that I bet 10 people in the world follow. And it's limited to academic journals. So I've tried to make it usable, if possible. So we can combine these 3 games and the 2 perceptual states, and you'll see I made it look like a little card game here to explore all the different possible situations just by flipping the 2 perceptual states and moving them around the 3 games. So I think this can help you as a security analyst exploit deception, avoid deception if it's coming at you. So there are 3 games, there are 3 states. I call them eye to eye, the con and the hypercon. I talked about those already briefly. And 2 perceptual states, awareness and false confidence. So with awareness, you've gotten it right. With false confidence, you've gotten it wrong. So eye to eye, that's the first level. This is James Garner in an Allied hospital. And it's really an Allied hospital. Everybody sees what's going on. It's nothing hidden. Examples of this, board games we play a lot are eye to eye. It doesn't mean you know what's going to happen at the eye to eye level, but all the strategies are known by both players. It doesn't mean I know which strategy you're going to pick, but I know what all your strategies are. So I often refer to this as just with the phrase, everything is as it appears to be. And if you look at cases of intelligence failure and surprise, you'll find oftentimes that the first bad assumption is that everything is as it appears to be. And that's not in fact the case. I think we all fall into this trap. Unless you're particularly cynical or jaded, I think this is going to be your first reaction in most cases. Somebody comes up to you, something happens, everything is as it appears to be. So that's this first level. Second level I call the con. This is where somebody has a secret and they're not telling you. This is the con artist you meet in the street. He's got a secret. You think you're playing the same game, you're going to win. You're going to get a good price on this iPad. He knows it's fake, you don't. Third level is the hypercon. So this is where you know that that's a fake iPad. This is where you're James Garner and you're sitting in the room and you figure out that this is a fake hospital. This opens up opportunity. This is that third level that you can exploit if you figure it out. So layered on these three levels, and you'll see just in 1 second here how I've laid this out as a card game. You've got the awareness and the false confidence. That's getting it right and getting it wrong. And this is where you would lay those. So on the left-hand side, you see eye to eye. And on the top, you've got red with the con and the hypercon. On the bottom, you've got blue with the con and the hypercon. So red and blue each hold their own perceptions. And then by using these little tags, awareness, false confidence, and I've added one for unknown just for in case there is uncertainty, you can add those to this little game board here. So you're playing a game of chess with your friend. You're both eye to eye. You put the little awareness counter on the eye to eye. That's the way the game is being played. In the con state, now you've got awareness at red's level. Let's say red is playing a con on you. You think it's still eye to eye. So you're falsely confident that you're in the eye to eye state. But red's in the con state. They hold an advantage. They've stepped up over you with the correct perception. So now you're at a disadvantage. Now you can turn that advantage to your advantage at the hypercon level. So that's represented here. Now red, you see, has false confidence. Red falsely believes that they're going to pull a con on you. But you've popped up one level now. You're at the hypercon level. And you have the correct awareness. So you can imagine this can play out. This can actually become fairly complex relatively quickly. And I have other tools to unpack this. But it becomes kind of complex too quickly. I wanted to keep it relatively simple because I think if you just think eye to eye, con, hypercon, and keep those in your head, it's a nice set of lenses to view the world through. So let's look at some examples. I put along the top there, these are just the three game boards. You've got the eye to eye, where everything is as it appears to be. You've got the con, where one side is exploiting a secret, and you've got the hypercon, where you're exploiting the exploitation of the secret. So, a lot of examples that you can find these in books, movies. I joke with my wife sometimes I should run off to Hollywood and become a screenwriter because once you are aware of a con and a hypercon, you'll see them all the time in movies. They show up all the time. It's the punch at the end of the movie. Oh, it was they were playing a hypercon the whole time. I thought it was just a con. So let me walk you through some examples. Again, if you walk out of here today just going, I've got three linguistic tags now that I can apply to the risk and opportunity of deception, I'll be happy. So let me walk through some examples. And I think you'll walk out of here going, okay, I know what a con is, I know what a hypercon is, and I can exploit these now. Ancient battlefield. This happened all the time. You find it in ancient Chinese writings. You'll even find it in some ancient classical writings in the Western world. The idea of a feigned retreat. So the eye to eye would be retreat. I'm on the battlefield, my adversary's retreating. Everything is as it appears to be, right? The risk for me is if I just go into everything thinking everything's eye to eye, and this is a feigned retreat, so up at the con level now, it's actually a feigned retreat. So it's a fake retreat. they're going to withdraw and then ambush me when I chase them. So this happens in history. One side gets all excited. They're retreating. We're going to crush them. And so they just flood in. Only, it's in a canyon now, and they get ambushed. So that's the con level. So what would the hypercon level be there? If you perceive that feigned retreat, you're aware they're going to do that, you could exploit that. So when they get you in the position where they think we got them, now you've actually got them. So you'll find it 2,000 years ago, longer, the idea of a feigned retreat. But now we have linguistic tags we can attach to this. World War II, Enigma. We're reading the Allies are reading the Germans' mail. That's a con. And if you've read about Enigma and what happened in World War II, there were tremendous advantages that the Allies gained from that con. You should ask yourself the question, though, if you're the Allies, what if they're playing a hypercon on us? And what would that mean? What would the hypercon mean? That would mean they know we're reading their mail. It would mean they could exploit us. What could they do? If you're the Germans now, you've seen through the con, what does the hypercon mean to you? A lot of opportunity. You've turned that risk, flipped it into an opportunity, and there's tremendous potential for opportunity there. Korean War, an example there, MacArthur's landing at Incheon. If you remember the Korean War, the Allies get pushed all the way down to the Pusan perimeter, and it looks very dire. So this is just the first few weeks and months of the war. MacArthur does an end run. He comes around, heads north up at Incheon. He lands there. The North Koreans panic and pull all the way back. It was a huge surprise, and it was supposedly impossible. The tides at Incheon made an amphibious landing supposedly impossible to pull off. So that MacArthur pulls a great con. So he's up at the con level. But what if the North Koreans had anticipated that and played the hypercon card, one level higher? Interestingly enough, and I don't remember the title of the book, but I read this a couple years ago. There's a book on China's involvement in the Korean War. They had apparently war-gamed MacArthur's possible actions and had identified Incheon as the most likely path. But miscommunication, whatever happened, the hypercon never happened. But imagine that you are so overconfident now that you're going to pull off this tremendous surprise. You've got your overconfidence blinders on now. They're waiting for you to exploit that. That's the hypercon level. Any era. Tunnels have been in the news a lot lately. Imagine, so everything as it appears to be would be eye to eye. You know what your adversary's strategies are. They can do this and this and this to you. They know you can do this and this and this in response. And you play that out eye to eye. Doesn't mean you know what strategy they're going to use, but you know, both sides know what the strategies are. A tunnel becomes a con. And what is our probably most likely human response? We find a tunnel. We want to shut it. We want to close it down. So you see through the con, you blow up the tunnel, you shut it down, but ask yourself, wait, what about a hypercon? Can I go one more level up? I know the tunnel is there. What can I do? What could you do? You find your adversary has built a tunnel into your territory. What might you do at that point? Well, maybe blowing it up isn't the best option. The hypercon opens up a whole new range of possibilities for you. You watch through who comes through. You don't let them know you found the tunnel. You've opened up a whole new range of hypercon strategies. Just another page of examples here. Espionage, probably one of the canonical examples. Spy represents a con. You've got a spy or an insider in your organization. You see through that. What's that mean? Do you go arrest them right away, throw them in jail? Or do you say, wait a minute, we've got some hypercon options here. Let's play it out at the hypercon level. There's the traditional con, I've used that example already, con on the street. The hypercon might be a sting. So now you're law enforcement. You can play that out as a hypercon. Honeypot would be a con. A honeypot perceived and exploited would be a hypercon. In the security world, an insider would be a con. You see through that, you perceive it. What does it mean? Now you've seen through it. Do you have opportunities now at the hypercon level? What's interesting to me is I've studied the literature of deception for a few years now. And for example, there's a great study by Barton Whaley, who's sort of the father of deception studies. And he wrote this originally in 1969, and I think it was republished in 2007. He took 115 cases, I think, of military deception in the 20th century, and he analyzed those. He looked for statistical lessons. What he was missing, in my opinion, were these simple linguistic tags. It'd be interesting to go back and look at those 115 cases, see how many of them were cons, how many of them are hypercons. Are there cultural biases here? I haven't done this, but it'd be interesting to take cases of deception and look for cultural biases. Do certain cultures play the con but never the hypercon? Are certain cultures inclined to play the hypercon card every time? What's your bias? I mean, we each have our own individual biases too. We've got cognitive biases, heuristics we play that play out poorly, and yet we tend to use them again and again, unfortunately. So here's another way I look at it. You've got a plane. Just picture a two-dimensional space. And that plane is defined by a number of knobs that you can turn to define possible scenarios. So you turn one knob and that's your adversary's capability. You turn another knob, that's your adversary's intent. You turn another knob and that's time, let's say. And maybe you have 5 or 6 different knobs that you can turn to explore. I almost picture an Etch-a-Sketch. And you turn these knobs and the little pointer goes all over the map. And you want to, if you're anticipating what your adversary might do, you want to explore that space as completely as you can. Well, cons and hypercons, I view that as playing on another level above that. It's another dial that you can turn in, it's another plane. So if you're able to exploit the con and the hypercon predictably, and you have linguistic tags, for example, and there are other ways to explore this in a systematic way, in my mind now you're playing on that level above. And imagine yourself, I'm trying to think of there's a book my kids read, and it's about is it Flat Stanley? I'm trying to remember. Anybody have kids? It's a two-dimensional world, and he lives in a two-dimensional world, or there's a character that lives in imagine that you live in a two-dimensional world, but there's a three-dimensional, a being that understands the three-dimensional world living with you. That being able to pop into the three-dimensional world and pop in someplace else back in your two-dimensional world would look like magic. I don't want to overstate the opportunities in cons and hypercons, but in effect, that's how I view it. That's what somebody who's really good at cons can do. They're popping up into that plane that's on the third dimension, and then they can pop down again later. So it looks like magic sometimes. Some of the cases of deception that the British pulled off in World War II are just absolutely fascinating. How they set them up. It takes time, like The Man That Never Was. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie or read the book. It's been another recent book that came out. They planned it out, they set it up. They're playing the con and they're thinking inside the adversary's head. The risk is, of course, and I don't know if they ask this question regularly, what if we got it wrong? What if we think we're pulling off the con and we're not? They've seen through it. It's a question worth asking. So oftentimes, it's just a matter of asking the right question at the right time, asking the right question early enough to identify the risk and exploit the opportunity. So I think here are some example questions that I think you should ask all the time. The first is everything as it appears to be? I think this is the question that unlocks it. This unlocks this perceptual, if there's a key that unlocks this plane, that's the question. Is everything as it appears to be? So one question, I've sat in meetings before where we've been talking, doing red teaming stuff, and I'll ask the question, what if that's what our adversary wants us to think? It's one of those unlocking kinds of questions, and I've watched meetings shift as people ask that question and think about it, because suddenly you see the evidence through a completely different lens, and your perspective shifts. So, is everything as it appears to be? Unlocking kind of question. Think about the levels. Am I being conned? How many of you actually ask that question once you start into something? Your deceiver, if they're a clever deceiver, knows what you want to see and what you want to hear, and if they're good, they're exploiting that. They know exactly which levers to pull to make you jump. You hope they're not the puppet master, and you're thinking it's eye to eye and they're playing the con. So, am I being conned? The question then is, if you think you're being conned, can I turn that into a hypercon? Can I pop up one more level? Because suddenly what was a risk turns into an opportunity. You're flipping that coin from risk to opportunity. Can my opponent turn the con into a hypercon? So you need to ask the reverse question of your opponent as well. And then finally, what if my perception is wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if, as you move up that through levels of awareness, your confidence, I think it's human nature, your confidence will go up. As you move from a con to a hypercon, my guess is you're just cranking up your confidence. You're anticipating that surprise that you're going to pull off. But what if you're wrong? That's a key question too. And oftentimes I think in these kinds of situations, it's just asking the right question at the right time. And you're looking at that trade-off between risk and opportunity. So from a security perspective, risk, opportunity, con is bad, hypercon is worse. Eye to eye is really bad if you're being conned. But another way to perceive this or look at this too is there are some circumstances where you want to be on the same page. You're negotiating with a customer. You are negotiating with a potential client. You don't want cons and hypercons to be happening. So there are some circumstances where you want to back that back down. You don't want a hypercon and a con being played. You want to see eye to eye. You want to be on the same page. And these are the sources I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of great literature out there on deception with tons of fascinating stories. Again, World War II, fascinating time. The British were masters of this. And they walked away with certain lessons like, they learned this early in the war. You want a goal for your deception activity. You don't want to do it just because you can do it. And you don't want your adversary to think something, you want them to do something. They got burned a couple times where they put the right idea into their adversary's head, and then their adversary did the exact opposite of what they thought they'd do. So with a deception, you want to point your adversary at an action. The deception story should be designed to get them to do something. They were really good too with their London controlling section. They realized we can't be pulling off multiple deceptions at the same time. All these stories are going to crash. We've got to have a mastermind overlooking our overall deception activities, and we got to plan these out, and we have to coordinate all of these. So anyway, if you're interested in the topic, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to go read about. It's more than just intuition. The really good deceivers understood that there are patterns here. And so hopefully I've given you a couple of patterns that you can look for now. Is it eye to eye? Is it a con? Is it a hypercon? When you go about your business. Just throw that in your toolkit. And remember to ask those kinds of questions. Where am I in that hierarchy? Where's my adversary? Can I pop up? Can I exploit this risk and turn it into an opportunity? All right, so I'm open for questions. Or Matt, if you want to build on anything that Yeah, we got to stand up here. Yeah, we got mics here.
So have you seen the strategies expressed in modern gaming, Xbox, that sort of thing?
In the Xbox, interesting. Well, it's popping up more and more. In fact, I've seen just a couple things recently about using gaming in. Oh yeah, am I seeing these in modern gaming, like on the Xbox? It's interesting. I'll just tell you what my experience is, because I like to play real-time strategy games with my kids. If you play a real-time strategy game against the AI, there's almost no opportunity to pull this off. That's just my perception. You play against a person, and the game suddenly is a lot more fun because you've got opportunity to deceive and be deceived. I don't know. Have you seen that, Matt? Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe we got a question way in the back.
Question back here?
Yeah, very seductive problem with the Spanish prisoner issue, is the idea that you're running a counter on the person, but they're already one step ahead of you.
Yeah.
Using that to drag you a bit further. What kind of experience do you have with that sort of thing, and how to recognize it, how to deal with it?
How do you recognize it? So the Spanish prisoner is a classic con. It's gone through some variations over the years, but it's been around for a long, long time. But I think, this is just my opinion, I think your intuition is usually telling you something in a circumstance like that. If you've got the tags and the labels to attach and perceive what's happening there, and ask the right questions at the right time, you're much better off than if you don't know what those questions are. So I think if you face a situation like that, your intuition is tickling you, ask those kinds of questions. Is everything as it appears to be? Is this potentially a con? Is this potentially a hypercon? I think it's interesting, if you look at most of the classic con cases, there's some books out there that they run you through all the classic con cases. You look at those, you apply these 5 questions to them again and again. I think that's a key right there, in my opinion, to start unlocking those. Yeah, question.
Have you looked at using these states or this game theory to focus on what sharks are appropriate to test for deception?
The CARCs? Okay, that's a Barton Whaley term for characteristics. I do. I've got something I call the deception wheel that builds on that. Well, maybe we should talk afterwards, because I think it gets, we'll have to talk separately. But yes.
Have you observed any classic or impressive examples of the use of deception in current cyber conflicts, whether espionage or real-world conflicts?
I'll turn to Matt for that.
I can't say in the conflict space, right? It's tough to define kind of what is conflict. I was writing down a couple of examples of just things that I've encountered since we had to submit the slides for here. And one that I think was a classic was a company that thought that they had suffered a compromise but had no IOCs on the network whatsoever. And they're kind of baffled as to what to do. And what they decided to do is actually initiate like a feigned incident response. So they went into incident response mode and started talking on the email and like going into high alert. That kicked the attacker into emergency mode, and they started to exfiltrate large quantities of data, started to wake up machines that were compromised, and that actually gave them the IOCs to go and kind of hunt the folks on the network. So I think that's kind of a classic example of a kind of con moving to hypercon through a feigning move, where they had suspected something but didn't have any technical IOCs to indicate they'd been compromised. In the conflict space, based on the definition of conflict, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. That's a pretty nuanced area.
Is there a study and analysis of certain countries' adoption of how sophisticated they are in the cyber deception space? Because I'm sure it's studied quite extensively, but there's sort of like an internal ranking of Pakistan sucks or these are good.
I haven't seen a ranking, but it would be fun to kind of put one together based on experience, peers in the industry. Because you see some entities that really don't care on the deception side, and then you see others that go through, fairly sophisticated measures to try and do, attacker obfuscation and things of that sort. So,
I think one of the things that is interesting to me is, in World War II, just because you were a good deceiver didn't mean that you couldn't be deceived. It's almost a law of deception. And one thing, when you think about the hypercon, I think it adds an element of risk where maybe you don't think risk exists. Because the con, if you're going to pull off a con, you may be overconfident, but that hypercon level suddenly introduces a risk that you may or may not be aware of. And so you see that in some cases, and it's, take the classic examples of deception, all the classic cases, look for the lessons, and then look for the hypercon. And like we were just talking about, I would be interested to run a study like that and see who runs hypercons. Anybody? I mean, it happens on the street. It happens in cyber. Are there cultural biases here? Are certain groups open to it and other groups not? I think it'd be a fascinating study, but I haven't seen one. Other than Whaley's work, which is kind of, it's canonical in the area, but I don't know who's moved past that.
Here. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah.
One more question. You posited a two-player game here. Have you done any iterative game theory work to this day?
No, I haven't. I've got ways of expanding this out into multiplayer games, but I haven't done any iterative work with. Oh, no. I take that back. I have. And again, we should talk afterwards, because I think it becomes a matter of perception, and you have to play this out a couple rounds sometimes. Because yeah, and in game theory, things become markedly more complex, as I'm sure you know, as you add more players and start to iterate. Things typically become a lot more complex, but I think it's one reason there's a stigma attached to game theory often. Even practitioners of game theory sometimes recognize that it moves off into the mathematical margins, exploring things that maybe aren't that useful in the real world. All right, any other questions?
Right here. There's one right
Over
there.
here, okay. Yeah.
I think you raise a very interesting point about the cultural biases and differences of the attitudes towards deception. And I think you see that play out in more than just the intentional deception, but even just the attitudes towards security as well. Is it okay to act like one of the competitors? It's the same sort of thing. Is it okay to deceive them, to steal from them, all of this cunning, this deception there? And I mean, it's at the local level, but also at the government level as well. And does that put Western companies and Western governments at almost a natural disadvantage on the cyber warfare field? And is there anything that can be done to counter that? And if so, where do you start? Is that something that should we be teaching in the academic field when we're training the next generation of cybersecurity warriors, for lack of a better term? Should we be encouraging deception to a greater extent? Should we be intending to reward conduct?
I think that's probably, you
Yeah,
can
yeah,
best
do that.
answer that, yeah.
We don't reward cunning, and a kind of mentor of mine that I know you studied as well with the General Van Riper, used to get in trouble wargaming in the U.S. military because he'd do things like wrap his Jeep in aluminum foil and make it look like a tank, and go different places, and they would constantly slap him down. The cultural issue is a huge one on multiple levels, though, where it impacts us. One is even just conception of time. The difference between short-term and long-term strategies, right? We get impacted with that at the kind of national security level all the time. Our perception of long-term does not match with other cultures. Another is just the basis of right and wrong. I talked about this a little bit at the executive summit, where IP theft as being an issue that we're promoting at a diplomatic level, say with Asian countries. There is not a matchup in perception of right and wrong on IP theft. You can talk to somebody on the other side of the negotiating table and say, hey, for 2,000 years we had all this great innovation in our culture. There was no such thing as patents. There was no such things as intellectual property protection. Now, over the past 100 years, all of a sudden that's important. So you could benefit for 2,000 years from all the things that we invented, but now we can't benefit our society from what you invented because we have these intellectual property protections in place. So whenever the U.S. government leads on the cyber conflict issues with an issue like that, we instantly are at a disadvantage because there's kind of a lack of parity in the cultural perception of right and wrong on an issue like that. So there's lots of barriers, and I think it's a completely different discipline to study, but it's something that constantly needs to be addressed, is addressing those cultural mismatches and lack of parity. No more question.
Since you opened it up, cyber espionage, high-level cyber plots that go on for several years, what is your opinion of, have they had one scrap of impact in terms of counteracting that?
I think maybe from a con perspective, where you have some feigned activity on matters that are completely inconsequential in the host country, where they'll say, hey, look, we arrested these 5 hackers, we're doing something in this space, and it completely doesn't address the issue. So no, I don't think that there will be. And my personal perspective is that there probably won't be, in the next 3 to 5 years, any impact in that area. What is going to happen is that you're going to have what I call kind of innovation parity, where there's going to be enough innovation stolen that both sides are kind of equal, and you can invest all your energy and smart people into stealing the incremental changes in innovation, or you can take those smart people and apply them to genuine innovation. And I think once you reach that point, which I think is kind of in the next 3 to 5 years, then that'll change the equation, and the discussion perspective will change. But thus far, I haven't seen anything that's been effective at all. We haven't decided anything. It's one of those things where you gave up your edge, right? Through the natural circumstances of the space that we're in. I don't think we're okay with that. I'm saying I think that's the reality that we're faced with. I don't think anybody thinks we're okay with that. I think that's just the natural course of how things are going to play out. Great. Are we out of time? What's the... Okay. Thanks.